Please let us in, it's -4 degrees. The voice was a fragile thread of sound, nearly lost in the roar of the Montana wilderness. A small, frost-covered hand hit the reinforced glass of the terrace door, a rhythmic, desperate pounding that shattered the absolute silence of the obsidian villa. I built this fortress to keep the world out, never imagining that the only thing capable of saving me was currently freezing to death on my doorstep, holding a secret that should have been buried in a grave. Watch this story until the end, because what happened next will change the way you see the world. Please give this story a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments, and if this narrative touches your heart, subscribe to the channel to support my work. I am truly counting on you. The wind in the Montana mountains does not just blow. It screams with a primal, hungry intensity. It is a world of whiteouts and bone-chilling gusts where the air feels like 1,000 needles against the skin. Perched on a jagged cliffside, the obsidian villa stands as a brutalist masterpiece of glass and steel, a dark crown on a throne of ice. This is the fortress of Elias Thorne. At 45 years old, Elias is a man defined by the sharp lines of his designer suits and an even sharper, more suffocating silence. He is the CEO who revolutionized the renewable energy industry, a titan who figured out how to harvest the sun and the wind to power millions. Yet he has lived for half a decade in a self-imposed darkness. To the outside world, Elias Thorne is a success story, a man who conquered the elements. To himself, he is a failure, a ghost haunting a glass cage. 5 years ago, his life was a vibrant tapestry of warmth and laughter. He had a wife whose smile could melt the harshest winter and a young daughter who was his entire universe. That tapestry was burned to ash in a tragic house fire that the investigators called a faulty wiring accident. Elias called it a personal failure. He wasn't there to pull them from the flames. He was in a boardroom, closing a deal, while the people he loved most were consumed by the heat. Since that night, the smell of smoke has never truly left his lungs. He retreated to this mountain tomb, running a global empire through fiber-optic cables, disconnected from any human touch, spending his nights staring at the flickering embers of his fireplace. He is wealthy beyond measure, but emotionally bankrupt, a man who has traded his soul for the cold safety of isolation. The villa itself is a monument to avoidance. Every pane of glass is triple reinforced, every steel beam is anchored into the bedrock, and every camera is designed to ensure no one approaches without his knowledge. He thought he had built a sanctuary where the past couldn't find him, but the mountains have a way of revealing what is hidden beneath the snow. On this particular night, the mercury has plummeted to a terrifying -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind is a physical force, rattling the heavy frames of his home. Elias sat in his leather armchair, the orange glow of the hearth the only light in the cavernous room, when the sound began. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the wind or the creak of the structure. It was the sound of a human hand, small and frantic, striking the glass. When Elias stood and walked toward the terrace doors, his heart hammered against his ribs, a sensation he thought he had forgotten. He expected to see a lost hiker, perhaps someone whose vehicle had slid off the mountain pass, or even a stray animal seeking the warmth of the glass. He slid the heavy door open, and the freezing air rushed in like a tidal wave of ice, threatening to extinguish the fire in the hearth. Standing there, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together like dry bones, was a 7-year-old girl. She was dressed in a coat far too thin for a Montana winter, her boots caked in frozen mud and snow. Her skin was a terrifying shade of blue, and her eyes were wide with a primal fear. But it wasn't just her presence that stopped Elias's heart. It wasn't even the fact that a child was wandering alone in a blizzard miles from the nearest road. It was what she was clutching in her small, trembling hand. Hanging from a frayed cord around her neck was a vintage silver compass. Elias felt the world tilt on its axis. He knew that compass. He knew the weight of the silver, the way the needle hovered just slightly off-center, and the specific scratches on the back where he had once engraved a message of love. It was a family heirloom, a piece of history he had personally placed in his daughter's casket 5 years ago. He had watched the lid close on that compass. He had watched it descend into the earth. The shock was so profound it paralyzed him, the freezing wind whipping his hair, his mind refusing to process the impossible sight before him. He reached out, his movements mechanical, and pulled the girl into the warmth of the villa. The moment she crossed the threshold, she collapsed, her strength finally failing her. Elias caught her, her small body feeling impossibly light and terrifyingly cold against his chest. He kicked the door shut, sealing out the storm, but the silence of the villa was gone, replaced by the heavy, frantic breathing of a child who shouldn't be there. As he carried her toward the fireplace, wrapping her in a heavy cashmere throw, he realized this wasn't a random encounter. This girl, whoever she was, hadn't just found his home by accident. She was a messenger from a past he thought was buried under 6 feet of dirt and 5 years of grief. He worked with a desperate, practiced efficiency, rubbing her hands and feet, trying to coax the warmth back into her frozen limbs. He brought a bowl of warm water and a cloth, his hands shaking as he wiped the frost from her cheeks. As the blue tint began to fade into a pale, sickly white, she opened her eyes. They were a piercing, intelligent green, and they looked at him with a recognition that chilled him more than the wind outside. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at him and whispered a single word that shattered his composure. Elias. The way she said it wasn't the way a stranger speaks a name. It was familiar. It was an invitation. She spoke in fragmented, breathless sentences, her voice a rasping shadow of what a child's voice should be. She talked about a place she called the Grey Orchard. She described a facility hidden in the valley far below, a place of white walls and long corridors, owned by the very parent conglomerate that controlled Thorn Industries. She spoke of the others, children who lived in the dark, and of a man named Julian Vane. The mention of that name felt like a physical blow to Elias's stomach. Julian Vane was more than a business associate. He was the chairman of the board, the man who had mentored Elias, the man who had stood by his side at the funeral of his wife and daughter. Vane was a man who viewed the world as a series of data points, a man who believed that progress required sacrifice. As Clara spoke, her words tumbling out in a feverish rush, a horrifying truth began to unfurl in the quiet of the villa. She knew things she couldn't possibly know. She knew the code to his private safe. She knew the lyrics to the lullaby his wife had composed for their daughter, a song that had never been recorded, never shared with anyone outside their home. Elias looked down at the silver compass resting on her chest. The needle spun erratically, caught in the magnetic interference of the villa's high-tech security systems, but the silver casing was real. It was tarnished, worn by time and touch, but it was the same object he had mourned over. He realized then that the fire 5 years ago might not have been the end he thought it was. The grief he had carried, the isolation he had built around himself, it had all been based on a lie curated by the very people he trusted. Clara wasn't just a runaway from a high-security facility. She was a living, breathing piece of a puzzle that suggested his daughter might not have died that night. The company hadn't just been running a renewable energy business. They had been running a shadow project, harvesting the lives of the vulnerable to create something Elias couldn't yet comprehend. He looked at the girl, her breathing finally evening out as the warmth of the hearth took hold. She was a messenger of hope, but she was also a harbinger of war. Once Julian Vane realized that Clara had reached the Obsidian Villa, the sanctuary would become a target. Elias, a man who hadn't raised his voice in half a decade, felt a primal protective instinct stir in the depths of his soul. He looked out at the dark mountains, knowing that somewhere out there, the security teams were already moving. The villa, once his fortress of solitude, was now a glass cage. To save this girl, and to find the truth about the family he thought he had lost, he would have to burn down the very empire he had spent his life building. The fire was coming again, but this time Elias Thorn wouldn't be in a boardroom. This time he would be the one holding the match. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows against the cold steel walls of the villa, making the room feel less like a sanctuary, and more like a waiting room for the end of the world. Elias sat on the edge of the hearth, his eyes never leaving the small girl wrapped in cashmere. Clara's breathing was shallow, a rhythmic rasp that seemed to sync with the howling wind outside. Every time she twitched in her sleep, Elias felt a jolt of electricity go through him. He looked at the silver compass resting on the table beside her. It was real. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by the thin mountain air or the crushing weight of his isolation. It was the same compass, with the same tiny dent on the rim from when his daughter, Lily, had dropped it on the marble floor of their old home 3 weeks before the fire. But that was impossible. Logic dictated that the compass was currently buried 6 feet underground in a cemetery in Seattle. Elias felt his mind fracturing, trying to bridge the gap between what he knew to be true and what was lying right in front of him. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked over to his massive mahogany desk. He tapped the glass surface, expecting the holographic interface of his communications array to spring to life. He needed to call his head of security. He needed to call a doctor. He needed to understand how a ghost had walked through his front door. The screen remained dark. He tapped it again, harder this time. Nothing. He checked the manual override, his fingers flying over the keypad he had designed himself. The diagnostic light blinked a steady, mocking red. The satellite uplink was down. The fiber optic lines were severed. It wasn't the storm. His system was built to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. This was a deliberate blackout. The Obsidian Villa, his impenetrable fortress, had just been turned into a tomb. Julian Vane had pulled the plug. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a prisoner in a glass cage. He looked back at Clara. Who was she? Was she a lure? Was she a miracle? He remembered the way she had said his name. Not Mr. Thorne, not Sir, but Elias. Only 3 people in the world had ever called him that with that specific inflection. 2 were dead, and the 3rd was the man who had likely just cut his phone lines. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. The green was even more piercing now that she was awake. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the high ceilings and the expensive art on the walls. She didn't look impressed. She looked terrified, as if the wealth surrounding her was just another form of iron bars. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chin. "He's coming, isn't he?" she whispered. Her voice was small, but it carried a weight of experience that no 7-year-old should possess. "Who is coming, Clara?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. He knelt beside her, trying to make himself look smaller, less threatening. "The man with the grey eyes," she said. "Julian. He says this is all his. He says the mountains, the wind, and even the people are just things he owns. He told us that you forgot about us. He told us you were the one who put us in the orchard." Elias felt as though he had been punched in the gut. "The orchard? Clara, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of a grey orchard. I build power plants. I build batteries. I don't hurt people." Clara looked at him with a profound sadness. "But you signed the papers, Elias. Every month the big trucks come with the medicine and the crates. They have your name on them. They have the little bird logo. The Thorne Industries logo, a stylized phoenix." Elias closed his eyes, his mind racing through 5 years of quarterly reports, logistics spreadsheets, and sub-conglomerate acquisitions. He had delegated so much. After the fire, he had become a ghost, signing whatever Julian Vane put in front of him, trusting his mentor to handle the details while he drowned in his own grief. He had been the engine of a machine he didn't even understand. He had been funding his own nightmare. "Why do you have this, Clara?" he asked, pointing to the silver compass. Clara reached out and touched the cool metal. "A lady gave it to me. The lady in white. She works in the room with the glass walls. She told me to run when the lights went out during the storm. She told me to find the house on the cliff. She said the man inside was waiting for me." Clara paused, her lip trembling. "She said my sister wanted you to have it back." "Your sister?" Elias breathed. "Lily," Clara whispered. "She was my friend. We lived in the same block. She told me stories about the man who made the stars stay on at night. She said he was a king in a glass castle." Clara's voice broke into a sob. "She got sick last winter. The lady in white said she went to sleep, but before she did, she gave me the compass. She told me it always points home." Elias couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Lily. His Lily hadn't died in the fire. She had been taken. She had lived for years in a facility funded by his own money, just miles away from where he sat in his ivory tower, mourning her. She had been alive while he was staring at the embers, and he had done nothing. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that threatened to break his ribs. He had been a king, all right, a king of fools, ruling over a kingdom of ash while his princess was being held in a dungeon he helped build. But there was no time for a breakdown. He heard it then, a low, rhythmic thrumming that wasn't the wind. It was the sound of rotors. A helicopter was approaching, fighting the turbulence of the mountain peaks. Julian Vane wasn't waiting for the storm to clear. He was coming to collect his property. Elias stood up, his face hardening. The broken man who had spent 5 years in silence was gone. In his place was the Titan who had clawed his way to the top of the world. He grabbed the compass from the table, his fingers tracing the scratches on the back. As he turned it over, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The hinge was slightly thicker than it should be. It wasn't just a compass. He used a letter opener from his desk to gently pry at the inner lining of the silver casing. It popped open with a soft click, revealing a tiny, ultra-thin micro SD card tucked into a custom-milled slot. This was the stolen property Vane was after. This was the Lady in White's insurance policy. He ran to his backup laptop, a rugged, offline unit he used for sensitive engineering schematics. He slid the card into the reader. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. The screen flickered, and then a directory of files appeared. Dates, names, medical charts. He clicked on a folder labeled Project Legacy. The first thing that popped up was a video file. He hit play. The image was grainy, taken from a security camera. It showed a sterile white room. In the center was a small bed, and sitting on that bed was a girl with golden hair. She was older than the daughter he remembered, but the way she tucked her hair behind her ear was unmistakable. It was Lily. She was holding the compass, her eyes fixed on the camera, as if she could see him through time and space. "Daddy," she whispered in the video. The audio was thin and crackly. "I know you're coming. The lady says you just need to find the way. I'm leaving the needle for you. Don't be sad anymore. Just find the others." The video cut to black. Elias stared at the dark screen, the silent tears finally spilling over. She had waited for him. She had spent the last years of her life believing in a father who was too broken to even look for her. The Grey Orchard wasn't just a lab, it was a factory for tragedy. Vane had staged the fire to remove the distractions from Elias's life, turning him into a focused, cold-hearted machine that would generate billions for the conglomerate. And when they found that his daughter had survived the initial accident, they didn't return her. They used her. They used her as a data point in a study on prolonged psychological trauma in high-potential children. The sound of the helicopter was louder now, the downwash rattling the villa's windows. Elias looked at Clara. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with terror. He realized then that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't go back to that night 5 years ago and stay home. He couldn't save Lily from the illness that had taken her in that cold white room. But he could save Clara. He could make sure that the Project Legacy ended tonight. "Clara," he said, his voice firm and steady, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. We are going to play a game. It's called The Invisible Ghost. I need you to go into the pantry behind the crates of water. There is a small door in the floor. You go down there and you don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name, you stay quiet until I come for you. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her small face determined. "Are you going to fight the man with the grey eyes?" Elias looked at the silver compass, the needle finally settling, pointing directly toward the valley where the Grey Orchard lay hidden. "No, Clara," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to show the world who he really is." As Clara disappeared into the hidden crawl space, Elias turned back to his laptop. He had 10 minutes before the security team breached his doors. The satellite was down, but he had one last card to play. Years ago, when he built the villa, he had installed a high-gain burst transmitter on the roof, disguised as a lightning rod. It was designed for one-way emergency broadcasts to the global power grid's emergency frequencies. It was a scorched earth option. He began to upload the contents of the micro SD card. The files were massive, hundreds of hours of footage, thousands of pages of incriminating evidence. He saw the names of senators, board members, and international bankers. This went far beyond Julian Vane. This was a web of corruption that spanned the globe, and he was about to rip the center out of it. The lights of the villa flickered. The external power had been cut. The backup generators hummed to life, their low vibration echoing in the floorboards. Elias stood in the center of the dark room, the only light coming from the glowing blue screen of his laptop. He could hear the heavy boots of men on his terrace. He could hear the sound of a glass cutter against the reinforced panes. He felt a strange sense of peace. For 5 years, he had been running from the cold, trying to build walls thick enough to keep the pain out. But the pain was already inside. It had been his shadow. Now, for the first time, he was stepping into the light. He wasn't the victim of a fire anymore. He was the fire. The terrace door shattered with a deafening crack. High-intensity flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding him. "Elias!" a voice boomed, a voice he had once respected, a voice that had offered him a shoulder to cry on at a funeral that was a lie. Julian Vane stepped through the broken glass, his grey overcoat pristine despite the storm. He looked around the room with a disappointed sigh. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Elias. Now give me the girl and the compass, and maybe we can forget this little lapse in judgment." Elias didn't move. He didn't even blink as the red laser dots of the security team's rifles danced across his chest. He just looked at Vane and held up the laptop. "The girl is gone, Julian, and the compass... Well, the compass just told me exactly where I need to go." Vane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're tired, Elias. The grief has finally broken your mind. Let's get you some help." "The upload is at 98%, Julian," Elias said, his voice cold and sharp as a mountain breeze. "In 2 minutes, the entire world is going to see the Grey Orchard. They're going to see Lily, and then they're going to see you." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Vane's face transformed from a mask of concern into something predatory and ancient. "Kill him," Vane whispered, and find that girl. The shattered glass of the terrace door crunched under the heavy, polished boots of Julian Vane's security team. The sub-zero Montana air rushed into the villa, turning the luxury living room into a frozen wasteland in seconds. Elias Thorne stood his ground, the blue light from his laptop screen casting a ghostly pallor over his face. He looked at the red laser dots dancing across his chest. But for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel the paralyzing grip of fear. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. The man standing across from him, Julian Vane, was no longer the mentor who had guided his career. He was the architect of his misery, a predator who had fed on Elias's grief to build a corporate empire. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Vane didn't look like a villain out of a storybook. He looked like a statesman, calm and composed, his grey eyes reflecting the flickering firelight with a terrifying lack of empathy. He raised a hand, and the security team paused, their fingers hovering over the triggers of their tactical rifles. Vane stepped closer, his breath hitching in the freezing air. He looked at the laptop, then back at Elias, a thin, mocking smile playing on his lips. He wasn't worried about the upload. He wasn't worried about the truth, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. "You always were a visionary, Elias," Vane said, his voice smooth and resonant, cutting through the howl of the wind. "But visionaries often miss the small details. You think that a satellite uplink and a few files will bring down a conglomerate that owns the very infrastructure of your reality? You think the world wants to know the truth? People don't want the truth, Elias. They want cheap energy, they want security, and they want someone else to blame for the darkness. We give them all three." Elias felt a surge of nausea. He realized that Vane wasn't just hiding his crimes, he was proud of them. To Vane, the children in the grey orchard weren't victims, they were investments. The accidents that cleared the way for Thorne Industries' expansion weren't tragedies, they were corporate restructuring. Elias thought back to the night of the fire, the way he had knelt in the ash of his own home, screaming for a god who didn't answer. He had looked to Julian Vane for strength, and the man had given him a suit, a mission, and a mountain to hide in. He had been a puppet, and he had paid for the strings with the lives of his wife and daughter. Deep in his mind, a voice whispered a name: Lily. He could see her golden hair, her lopsided smile, the way she used to hold the silver compass as if it could lead her to a world where magic was real. He had funded her prison. Every luxury in this villa, every piece of steel and glass, had been bought with the blood of his own family. The internal monologue was a roar of guilt and rage, a storm more violent than the one outside. He had been the engine of his own destruction, but he wouldn't let Vane win. Not tonight. The situation worsened when one of the security guards, a man with a jagged scar across his temple, began sweeping a thermal scanner across the floor. The device beeped, a steady, rhythmic sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Elias's heart stopped. He looked toward the pantry, where Clara was hiding beneath the floorboards. The thermal signature of a living, breathing child was a beacon in the cold house. The guard looked at Vane and nodded toward the kitchen. "Check the floor," Vane commanded, his voice dropping an octave. "And if the girl is there, bring her to me, gently, if possible. She's a very expensive piece of equipment." Elias moved, but he was too slow. 2 guards intercepted him, pinning his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. He struggled, his boots sliding on the ice-covered marble, but he was an engineer, not a soldier. He watched in horror as the guard with the scar kicked open the pantry door and began shifting the crates of water. The sound of the wooden hatch being pried open echoed through the villa. Clara's muffled whimper was the most painful sound Elias had ever heard. It was the sound of a child who had run for miles through a blizzard, only to find that the castle she had reached was just another dungeon. But it was in this moment of total despair that the turning point arrived. As the guard reached into the crawlspace to pull Clara out, she didn't come quietly. She didn't scream either. Instead, she did something that stopped everyone in the room. She reached into the cuff of her boot and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, thrusting it toward the guard. "Read it," she hissed, her voice trembling but fierce. "The lady in white said to read it before you touch me." The guard hesitated. Even a man hired to do Vane's dirty work had a limit, and there was something in Clara's eyes, a fierce ancient defiance, that gave him pause. He took the paper, his flashlight illuminating the frantic handwritten scrawl. Vane stepped forward, his composure finally slipping. "Give that to me," he snapped. But Elias had seen the guard's face change. The man's eyes widened, and he looked at Vane, not with loyalty, but with a sudden, dawning horror. He didn't hand the paper to Vane. Instead, he stepped back, his rifle lowering. "This isn't what you told us, sir," the guard whispered. "You said we were recovering a runaway from a medical trial. You didn't say anything about this." Elias seized the moment. He knew his house better than anyone. He knew the hidden frequencies and the secret overrides. With a desperate heave, he broke free from the guards holding him and slammed his hand onto a hidden panel beneath the edge of his mahogany desk. It wasn't a communication override. It was the Scorched Earth Protocol, a system he had built to protect his intellectual property in the event of a corporate coup. The villa's lights didn't just flicker. They turned a blinding, strobing white. An ear-piercing frequency began to pulse from the hidden speakers in the ceiling, a sound designed to disorient and incapacitate. The security guards clapped their hands to their ears, their rifles clattering to the floor. Vane stumbled back, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. Elias lunged for Clara, pulling her from the crawl space and shielding her with his own body. In the chaos, he grabbed the paper from the guard's trembling hand. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. It was a list of names, not just the children in the orchard, but the names of the men who had been paid to look the other way. And at the top of the list, written in his wife's own handwriting, was a date. The day of the fire. The revelation was like a lightning strike. His wife hadn't died instantly. She had lived long enough to realize who had set the fire. She had lived long enough to hide a message in the one place she knew Elias would eventually look, the Silver Compass. The lady in white wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a nurse who had been his wife's best friend, a woman who had stayed in the facility for years, waiting for the right moment to send Clara out with the truth. The upload on the laptop hit 99%. The blue bar crawled toward the finish line, fueled by the burst transmitter on the roof. Vane, recovered from the initial shock of the frequency pulse, drew a sleek silver pistol from his coat. His mask of civility was gone now, replaced by the raw, ugly desperation of a man who realized his world was about to end. "Shut it down, Elias," he screamed over the pulse of the alarm. "Shut it down, or I'll kill the girl right in front of you." Elias looked at the screen, then at Clara, then at the man who had stolen his life. He felt the weight of the silver compass in his pocket. It was no longer a symbol of his grief. It was a weapon. It was a guide. It was the needle that would finally point him toward justice. He didn't move to the laptop. He didn't try to stop the upload. He simply stood in front of Clara, a human wall of steel and regret. "You can't kill the truth, Julian," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo louder than the alarm. "The needle is already moving, and it's pointing right at you." The laptop chimed, a simple, polite sound that signaled the completion of the upload. At that exact moment, the villa's external monitors, which had been dark for hours, suddenly flared to life. They weren't showing the security feeds. They were showing news broadcasts from London, New York, and Tokyo. The files had reached the global servers. The images of the Grey Orchard, the medical charts of the Project Legacy children, and the voice of Lily Thorne were being broadcast to 1 billion screens simultaneously. Vane stared at the monitors, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the man he had spent 5 years trying to break. He realized that he hadn't just failed to destroy Elias Thorne. He had accidentally created the only person capable of destroying him. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the room as the reality of the situation settled into the bones of everyone present. The security team was already backing away, their loyalty evaporating as they realized they were now protecting a dead man walking. Elias reached out and took Clara's hand. Her palm was warm now, her pulse steady against his skin. He looked at the shattered glass and the freezing storm outside, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't want to hide. He wanted to walk out into the cold and let the world see what was left of him. But the fight wasn't over. Vane was still standing there, the gun trembling in his hand, a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. "What now, Elias?" Vane whispered, his voice cracking. "You think you've won? You think they'll let you live after this?" Elias looked at the silver compass, the needle steady and true. "I don't care if I live, Julian. I just care that they know. I just care that she's safe." But as Vane tightened his finger on the trigger, a new sound began to rise over the wind, a sound that made even the CEO of Thorne Industries turn his head in confusion. It wasn't a helicopter. It was the sound of sirens, hundreds of them, echoing up from the valley below. The world wasn't just watching. It was coming for them. And the fire that Elias had started was about to consume everything Julian Vane had ever built. The silver pistol in Julian Vane's hand didn't just represent a threat. It was the final gasp of a dying era. Outside, The sirens of the Montana State Police and federal tactical units were no longer a distant echo. They were a roar, their blue and red lights reflecting off the snow-covered peaks like a jagged neon crown. The Obsidian Villa, once a fortress of silence, was now the center of a global storm. Julian's eyes darted from the monitors, where his face was being branded as a criminal on every major network, to Elias, who stood like a statue of granite in the center of the room. "You've destroyed everything," Julian whispered, the gun trembling. 40 years of building, of shaping the future, all gone because of one girl and a trinket. "It was never about the future, Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "It was about control. You didn't shape the future. You stole it from children who hadn't even lived it yet. You stole it from my Lily, and you tried to steal it from Clara." The security team, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to retreat toward the shattered terrace doors. They were mercenaries, and mercenaries don't die for a man whose bank accounts are being frozen in real time by federal authorities. The guard with the scar, the one who had held the list of names, looked at Elias and gave a curt, almost respectful nod before vanishing into the blizzard. Vane was alone. The titan of industry was suddenly just a frail man in an expensive coat, standing in the wreckage of a lie. But Vane wasn't finished. With a sudden, desperate scream, he lunged toward the laptop, intending to smash the hardware, to stop the digital ghost he had unleashed. Elias moved with a speed he hadn't possessed in years. He didn't use a weapon. He used the weight of his own regret. He tackled Vane, the two men crashing into the mahogany desk. The silver pistol skittered across the floor, sliding toward the hearth where the embers were still glowing a deep, vengeful orange. The struggle was brief. Vane had lived his life behind desks and in the back of limousines. Elias had been forged in the rugged terrain of his own ambition and grief. He pinned Vane to the floor, just as the front doors of the villa were breached with a thunderous boom. Federal agents swarmed the room, their voices a chaotic symphony of commands. "Federal agents, drop the weapon. Hands in the air." Elias stepped back, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on Clara. She had emerged from behind him, her small hand reaching out to touch the silver compass that lay on the floor near the gun. He ignored the agents, ignored the flashing lights, and knelt beside her. He gathered her into his arms, and this time, the cold didn't matter. The warmth of the truth was enough to keep the winter at bay. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of fire and ice. The Grey Orchard was raided by federal authorities within hours of the broadcast. It was exactly as Clara had described, a high-security facility hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any commercial map. Dozens of children were rescued, many of whom had been declared dead in accidents years prior. The scandal didn't just take down Julian Vane, it dismantled the entire parent conglomerate, revealing a rot that reached into the highest levels of government and finance. Julian Vane would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, a man who once owned the sky now confined to a concrete box. But for Elias, justice wasn't found in a courtroom. It was found in a small, sterile office at the local hospital where he sat with a federal investigator. The man handed Elias a file, the real medical records of Lily Thorne. Elias's hands shook as he read the pages. It was true. Lily hadn't died in the fire. She had been taken and kept in the orchard for 4 years. She had been the star patient, a child whose intelligence and resilience had fascinated the researchers. But she had never broken. She had spent her days telling the other children stories of the king in the glass castle who would one day come for them. She had passed away exactly 1 year before Clara's escape, a victim of a respiratory infection that the facility's doctors couldn't or wouldn't treat. "She wasn't alone, Mr. Thorne," the investigator said softly. "The nurse, the woman the children called the Lady in White, she stayed with her until the end. And she was the one who gave Clara the compass. She told Clara that Lily's last wish was for the needle to finally point home." Elias walked out of the hospital into the crisp air of a Montana spring. The snow was finally beginning to melt, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. He didn't go back to the Obsidian Villa, not as a resident. He had sold his shares in Thorne Industries, liquidated his fortune, and used every cent to establish the Lily Thorne Foundation. The villa, the brutalist masterpiece of glass and steel, was gutted and redesigned. It was no longer a tomb of isolation. It was a recovery center for the children of the Grey Orchard. The reinforced glass now looked out onto gardens, and the silent corridors were filled with the sounds of laughter and healing. The final scene of this journey takes place in a real orchard, miles away from the cliffside. It is a place of apple trees and wildflowers where the wind smells of blossoms instead of ice. Elias is standing in the center of a young grove, his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in soil. He is no longer the man in the sharp suit. He is a man who has found a new way to build. Clara is there too. Her skin is no longer the terrifying shade of blue. It is flushed with the health of a child who knows she is safe. She is holding a small sapling, her eyes bright with a future that is finally hers to keep. They are planting a tree together, a living monument to a girl who never gave up hope. Elias reaches into his pocket and pulls out the silver compass. He looks at it for a long time, tracing the scratches on the back. He remembers the weight of the grief that used to anchor him to the dark. He remembers the sound of the pounding on the glass on that -4-degree night. He realizes that while he couldn't change the tragedies of the past, he found his true wealth in the life he chose to protect in the present. He hands the compass to Clara. "Where does it point, Clara?" he asks softly. Clara opens the lid. The needle spins for a moment, then settles. It doesn't point north toward the mountains. It doesn't point toward the cold. It points directly toward the small, warm farmhouse at the edge of the orchard where a meal is being prepared and a new life is beginning. "It points home," she says, her voice clear and steady. Elias smiles, a genuine, warm expression that reaches his eyes for the first time in 5 years. "Then that's where we'll go." The moral of this story is that justice is the only path back from the cold. We are not defined by the walls we build to keep the world out, but by the doors we open to let the light in. True power isn't found in the energy we harvest from the sun or the wind, but in the warmth we provide for those who have nowhere else to go. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that it's never too late for a second chance, please subscribe to the channel. I promise to bring you stories like this frequently, to make your days a little more meaningful and your heart a little lighter. And please, tell me in the comments, on a scale of 0 to 10, what grade this story deserves. I read every single one of your messages, and your support is what keeps these narratives alive. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'm counting on you.